the deputy publisher of Jewish Currents. And I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I think we all know that the conversation that we're about to hear is a really important one, and Jewish Currents is really thrilled to be a part of it, and especially to be partnering with Tzedek, which is, I don't need to tell you, a very special place. I want to make a special shout out to our Jewish Currents sustaining members. I made the mistake of encouraging our members to email me personally for tickets to this, and I'm surprised that my inbox is still alive. But I say that because I actually think it's a testament to how incredibly involved, dedicated, invested, committed this community is. Both Jewish Currents, Tzedek, and the very special people who belong to both. So thank you for being here tonight, online, in person, and reminding us all of how strong our community is. It's really important in this moment. The other thing I wanted to say is that I've been thinking a lot about how a magazine is a two-dimensional object. It's like something that you read alone by yourself. It's a solitary experience. And yet, that's really the opposite of what we at Jewish Currents, and also I think Tzedek, are trying to do. We're trying to do something collective. We're trying to be together, to think, to reflect, to think on these really hard questions of this moment, and hopefully ultimately to act together. So I think that's why events like this are so important, and why I flew out today from New York for it, and I'm flying back tomorrow, and I hope to do it again really soon. I think this is exactly what we need in this moment. So thank you to Tzedek for hosting us. Thank you, Brant and Peter, for this conversation. Thank you for all the folks who worked on this event and made it possible. And especially thank you all for being here. Housekeeping. So I think Brant and Peter will talk for about an hour, and then we'll have time for some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Naomi. And I want to ditto everything Naomi said in terms of gratitude for your being here. I'm really delighted and honored to be able to have this conversation with Peter and to share it with all of you. Thank you to Jewish Currents. Thank you, Naomi. I want to also thank Daniel May of Jewish Currents, who was also very instrumental in making this all happen. The folks at Tzedek Chicago, Leah Yaknin-Dawson and Aviva Stein, and the good folks at Bramble Arts Loft. This is the first time we've done a program here, so welcome to our living room. Yeah, I'm very, very happy that we've been able to make this happen. So the title of our program this evening, as it's been published, is Judaism After Genocide. And I think I want to put a bit of a finer point on that. It's really, I think what I'm interested in exploring is Judaism after a Jewish genocide. And what does that mean in terms of Judaism? What does that mean in terms of making Jewish community, in terms of our relationships with one another and our vision for the Jewish future? So as far as the program, we're calling it a conversation. And I think we're envisioning it as kind of a fishbowl of Peter and I having a conversation that is a public one. And it's circumscribed, I think, by the subject matter, that this is really primarily a Jewish conversation. And as Peter frames his latest book as a kind of a conversation with a Jewish friend, I think it's a Jewish conversation, but it's not exclusively a Jewish conversation. And I want to sort of put that out there at the outset, that it is one that also includes people who aren't Jewish. And it really is an open conversation because it impacts in so many different ways. So I just wanted to say that in terms of framing. I also want to say, and I think I feel compelled to say, that the primary moral need of the moment is not the well-being of Judaism. I would say it's the well-being of the Palestinian people right now in this ongoing genocide. As we speak, that has been going on for well over 2 years. Judaism will continue, and that will be an ongoing conversation. But I think in terms of the primary need of the moment, the well-being of the Jewish future, pales in comparison to the human rights need that is crying out to us out of Gaza and Palestine, and that so many people I know in this room have been working so hard to end. So, yeah, I think that's enough of the framing. So, Peter, hello, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
So before we get into the book, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, as a public figure, as a public intellectual, you've been writing about this issue at length for quite a while. And one of the things that I think that I've been struck by, I think so many people have been struck by, is that your willingness to share your own struggle with this issue, your own personal evolution on your relationship with this issue over time, in a very, very open way. And I, like many in this room, have been following your work for a long time. I've been very struck by these moments that it looks like you're openly moving from one place to another. I probably wasn't the only person who fell out of my chair when I opened the New York Times one morning and saw an op-ed by Peter Beinart entitled, "I no longer believe in a Jewish state." So I just wanted to ask how, if you could chart a little bit about the milestones along the way that caused you to move on this issue or challenged you to move to a new place on this issue, and also just what it has meant to you to struggle with this issue so publicly, and how that has impacted on you and your own experience of the issue.
Thank you. I'm also really glad to be here. I also wanted to thank Naomi in particular, who did so much work to make this possible. And also just wanted to say, and it's connected to the question in some ways, when I talk about the things that I used to think in the past that I now don't think anymore, I often am kind of, there's a voice in my head that goes, well, then what do you think now that you will think is wrong at some future point, right? Because I don't think I figured everything out, and from now I'm infallible. And so I wanted to say that by way of saying, whenever I speak, I really hope that there are people in the audience who disagree with me from whatever perspective, and I'm really grateful when people who disagree, who come knowing that they're going to disagree, still come to listen. I feel like so frequently people kind of tend to only go to seek out speakers who are going to reaffirm what they already believe. So if you're someone who's going to hear something from me that you really disagree with, then you're the person who I'm really most grateful is here. And it says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise, the one who learns from all people. And I feel like the person who travels the furthest ideological distance is the person who's showing the greatest wisdom. I think in some ways, I don't think my story is that dissimilar from a lot of other people. Maybe it's just been more public, or maybe it's a little bit more of a kind of a cliche of a story. Maybe I'm a little bit older than some others have had the story, but there are many others of my age too. I think I grew up in a family where we thought about Israel. I was encouraged to think about Israel within a framework of a certain narrative of Jewish history, which will be very familiar to everybody, which was Jews didn't have a state. They were unsafe. We were unsafe, culminating in genocide. A state was the answer to make Jews safe. And I think, everyone's family has their own particular stories of that sense of insecurity and fear. But for me, it was particularly my maternal grandmother, who had an unusual Jewish story in which her family came from the Isle of Rhodes. And then she was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and then was in the Belgian Congo, of all places, and then in South Africa. And all of those places, in some ways, had elements of fragility. There weren't Jews in Rhodes anymore after the Holocaust. There weren't many Jews in Egypt. And she would always tell me when I would come to visit from America, and I would say, America's great. And she would say, don't get too comfortable in America. Israel is the place where ultimately you can put your sense of security. Her brother had moved from Egypt to pre-state Palestine. And so I think that, it wasn't that I grew up in a family in which we couldn't criticize Israel at all. I mean, I think it was kind of liberal Zionists. So there were, when Israeli right-wing figures would be there, we say, oh, we don't like those guys. I wish they would choose the Labor Party leaders. And, in an abstract sense, the two-state solution seemed like a good idea, but there wasn't a sense of a moral emergency. And there wasn't any, questioning of the legitimacy of the idea of a state, because I wasn't raised to think about Zionism, as Edward Said said, from the standpoint of its victims. I just wasn't raised to think about Israel from a Palestinian perspective. And so, and I think like a lot of other people, I thought I knew a lot about Israel, because I had been going to Israel. My father worked in Israel. I felt, I could see how much my father loved being in Israel, how much my grandfather loved being in Israel, the sense of a Jewish civilization. It's very powerful when you're used to being a small minority. And I think the first thing that really struck me when I first, much too late, but really in my early 30s, spent time in the West Bank with Palestinians was this realization that I actually knew so little about the way the Israeli state functioned for Palestinians. It was just, I just had no concept of the mechanisms, the daily, the way in which the state interacted with people who didn't have citizenship in it, who were living under military law. So that was the first thing, which very destabilizing for me, because I was used to being in environments where I felt like I was the expert. Let me tell you about Israel, and then I realized there's so much that I really don't know at all, And the second thing was, and again, I think this is typical, is I think I understood that the occupation of the West Bank wasn't a great thing, and it wasn't ideal and it wasn't optimal. But, it's very different to know that in a kind of abstract sense. And then to be confronted with the kind of ground level brutality and terror of living under a state that is completely unaccountable to you, a state that can take whatever it wants from you with basically complete impunity. And your Jewish neighbors can take whatever they want from you, right? Because the state serves them. It's responsible to them. It's not responsible to you, right? And I had never lived my life. I had never been in a situation in my life where I had felt that kind of sense of terror vis-a-vis the state. So I wasn't prepared for the experience of meeting people who were just recounting their daily lives as what seemed to me like stories of one terror after another, really. And then I think the third thing is that, which was the most difficult thing, was that I was not, as I began to interact with Palestinians and then continue to interact with Palestinians, I realized that I was not prepared for the fact that Palestinians were fully human, in the sense that, I'd meet lots of different Palestinians. They were whatever, the whole range of human qualities that you would find with any other group of people: thoughtful, quirky, interesting, funny, whatever range. And I found myself in my brain being surprised that nobody seemed like they woke up in the morning wanting to kill Jews. And it made me realize that I had carried around a lot of dehumanization of Palestinians I wouldn't have said that if you'd asked me. I said, no, I'm kind of a liberal, but actually I had grown up my entire life hearing people talk about Palestinians without listening to Palestinians. And the Palestinians were generally described in this kind of vague, kind of menacing, this vague menacing group, and that is a recipe for dehumanization. I mean, it's still so somewhere between enraging to me and profoundly depressing to me that we have even another generation of American Jews growing up in institutions where from the minute they can, from their earliest memories, they hear about Palestinians and they don't hear from Palestinians. And it's not, and it's just this cycle of dehumanization and racism and fear that is replicated unless the kids can kind of break out of it. But why should the kids have to break out of it? I mean, it's such a, and then feel betrayed by their institutions or stay in that defensive crouch and, as they why not educate them, and in a way that, anyway, this is a longer answer, but I guess I'll fast forward. I still, even after that experience, and even for many, many years after that, and much more learning from Palestinians, I still thought in terms of the two-state paradigm. I thought, look, the PLO has accepted this, so I mean, and also I still felt that the idea of a Jewish state was a certain guarantee of protection. I just wanted it to be small. I didn't want it to hold people who didn't have citizenship. The problem, though, was that I found that year after year after year, I was one of these people who was saying the two-state solution is done. right? It's always dying. And at a certain point, it began to seem kind of ridiculous,
Yeah,
you know? And I remember actually a Palestinian friend of mine said, listen, Peter, nothing is perpetually dying. At some point, it's dead, you know? And I realized that the reason that for me it was always perpetually dying was I was not, it was too frightening to me and too difficult to imagine thinking outside that paradigm. But I do think as a writer, I have found at various times in my experience that I notice that if I start to lose conviction in something, I can't write about the subject well. It just stops being convincing to me. And I'm quite sure if it's not convincing to me, it's not convincing to anyone else. And so I kind of felt like I needed to try to think outside the paradigm and see if I could get anywhere. And it was actually during COVID and I had a little bit more time. And I just started reading a lot of writing of people who were not thinking within the partition paradigm. Most of them, not all of them, but many of them, and most of them were Palestinians. And I think the more I read, the more it became less unimaginable and less frightening to me. And I do think at that point, my parents are South African. And I think in some ways that experience of thinking also helped me remember certain things about all of the times that I, growing up, heard, you know, my relatives and other white South Africans say, you know, if we don't have a state that is for us, that we control, that we will be radically unsafe. I mean, that was considered it was considered as obvious among white South Africans as it is among Jewish Israelis, maybe even more so. And it helped, and I started to think back about that discourse and think more and more about why that turned out not to be the case, actually. And it was from that, I think that then led me to make this shift.
Yeah, well, there's much that you said that I can identify with myself, particularly when you start to meet Palestinians as human beings, that more than anything you read or any argument anyone can make is that an important turning point. So you sort of left off during COVID, and I think sounds like you're referring to two articles that you read, that you wrote rather. Both of them are in Jewish Currents. One of them was called Yavna, the Jewish Case for Equality in Israel-Palestine. And that was the one the shorter version of that was in the New York Times. I no longer believe in a Jewish state. And then I think a year later came Tshuva, a Jewish Case for Palestinian Refugee Return. And I was, I want to get to the book, but those articles really moved me in many ways. There's also stuff I disagreed with in many ways. And there was one passage in particular that I wanted to read, and I've been eager to talk to you about this and to drill a little bit deeper. This comes from the Yavna, the earlier article. The painful truth is that the project to which liberal Zionists like myself have devoted ourselves for decades, a state for Palestinians separated from a state for Jews, has failed. The traditional two-state solution no longer offers a compelling alternative to Israel's current path. It risks becoming instead a way of camouflaging and enabling that path. It is time for liberal Zionists to abandon the goal of Jewish-Palestinian separation and embrace the goal of Jewish-Palestinian equality. This doesn't require abandoning Zionism. It requires reviving an understanding of it that has been largely forgotten. It requires distinguishing between form and essence. The essence of Zionism is not a Jewish state in the land of Israel. It is a Jewish home in the land of Israel, a thriving Jewish society that both offers Jews refuge and enriches the entire Jewish world. It's time to explore other ways to achieve that goal, from confederation to a democratic binational state that don't require subjugating another people. It's time to envision a Jewish home that is a Palestinian home too. So I wanted to, for us, to drill a little bit deeper into this issue of the essence of Zionism as home rather than a state, and distinguishing between form and essence, because I think that's a place where you and I differ. I think since 48 in particular, form and essence have kind of become fused, and we can talk about that. But also, you referred to Israel as a refuge, which is a kind of a classic Jewish trope that you yourself mentioned is problematic. And so referring to yourself as a liberal Zionist, but saying it's time for liberal Zionists to embrace the one-state paradigm. I guess my question is, do you still consider yourself to be a liberal Zionist? And to go a bit more deeply into what your vision of Zionism then would be, given that you're giving up on the notion of a sovereign Jewish state.
Yeah. So when one is talking about the political Zionism that emerges and has been the ideology of the state since 1948, I would agree. I think that kind of Zionism is fundamentally in contradiction to the basic principles of liberal democracy, which is equality under the law. Not to mention the need for historical justice, which I also believe in. I think and so I would agree that the essence of that Zionism which has existed since the state was created is Jewish supremacy. I think that the Zionism that I was thinking about and talking about, I was particularly influenced in writing that book by a Hebrew University historian named Dmitry Shumsky called Zionism Beyond the Nation State, which is writing before 1948, where there's more fluidity about what this project means. Now, I want to acknowledge there's actually I don't know if you saw, there was quite a good piece in Jewish Currents by the Palestinian legal theorist Rafe Tzedek about Martin Buber, who was, maybe the most famous of the kind of, cultural Zionists of the 30s and 40s who opposed partition into a Palestinian Jewish state. And Drake rightly points out that Buber was a man of his time who had ideas that we would now think of as kind of, in their own way, kind of colonial. But the reason that I think, and I understand why many people, and probably frankly most of my colleagues at Jewish Currents would disagree with that. The reason that I think there is something valuable in looking at the non-state cultural Zionist tradition, the Zionist tradition of Buber, of Magnus, of Henrietta Scholl, the founder of Hadassah, of a very young Noam Chomsky, who was in a Zionist youth movement very early in his life, which opposed the creation of a Jewish state, because that was still something that was possible in the 1930s and 40s, right? To be a Zionist who opposed the creation of a Jewish state and who believed in a binational state. I think the reason that tradition is worth engaging in, I think, not uncritically, but I think worth thinking about and trying to learn from, is that the conversation today is almost without, simply assumes the idea that flourishing Jewish Hebrew-speaking existence in Israel and Palestine is dependent on a Jewish supremacist state. And so I think there is something important in looking back to figures who actually saw those things as very different, right? Who were very invested in a particular kind of Jewish life in Israel and Palestine. Obviously, there's been Jewish life in Israel and Palestine for a very, very, very long time, right? Long before any form of Zionism. But we're particularly interested in, again, in a Jewish culture that was made possible by having people speaking Hebrew, particularly speaking Hebrew in this place. And yet believe not only that project did not require Jewish statehood, but in fact that Jewish statehood would be fundamentally antithetical to that project, which I think actually is something I believe today. That, again, it's considered, many people would look at me like I have two heads for saying this, but I fundamentally don't believe that a supremacist state provides safety. I think supremacist state creates massive amounts of structural violence on the people who are considered legal inferiors. And even if a lot of that violence goes unnoticed, it's still there. And all of that violence ultimately, I think, creates less safety for everybody. Whereas giving people equality under the law and a voice in government, I actually think gives people mechanisms for having the government respond to them, which don't require violence, don't require picking up guns. And so I believe that basic idea that the cultural Zionists had in that regard was right. Now, again, I think that I know that there are many people on the left and many people in Palestinian national circles, going back to Martin Buber, who have rejected the idea of binationalism, you know? And I understand that perspective, right? The perspective is that binationalism assumes a kind of equality between settler and native, right? Why would you do that, right? And it is, and so in this vision, you're talking about a decolonized Palestine, in which presumably there are Jewish Palestinians as well as there are Christian and Muslim Palestinians. I myself don't think that that's any time in the foreseeable future a realistic vision. I think that you have two communities with national identities, and I think that's going to be the case for a long time to come. And so I think it's important to recognize the binational character of this place within a framework in which all individuals between the river and the sea are treated equally under the same law, and in which there is a process of historical justice of Palestinians being able to return to the places from which their families were expelled and be compensated, etc.
Yeah, you know, like you, I've also been very inspired by the work of cultural Zionists like Buber and Magnus and Arendt, and Ahad Ha'am was kind of the first Zionist thinker that I read, and was very taken by this vision of a non-statist Zionism. And I think early in my life, that was the way I identified. You know, one of the things that I think I've come to grips with as a Jew who now identifies as an anti-Zionist is that, you know, if they were all alive today, they would be considered anti-Zionist as well. That they were a product of a certain place and time. And we're always, by the way, in the minority. I mean, political Zionism and the Zionist movements that Herzl started, the Zionist Congress, the World Zionist Organization, the JNF, all of these arms, the Jewish Agency that came out of this movement was the dominant form of Zionism. And the culture Zionists were really kind of a voice in the wilderness. It wasn't to say they were not important. I think, Hebrew University, for instance, was founded by cultural Zionists, Magnus and Ahad Ha'am. But for me, and I think this is more than just academic, I think after, that political Zionism was the dominant form. And after 48, it was the only form of Zionism, really, or at least the only form of Zionism that had a real impact on real people's lives. It was embodied by the State of Israel and all of these other organizations that are predicated on maintaining a Jewish majority in the land. That's why these organizations exist, because in order to have a Jewish state, you need a Jewish majority. And for me, I could never square that circle.
Right.
That,
at least a Jewish majority of people who can vote.
Right. And right now the elections are going on, and all my liberal Zionist friends are urging people to vote. And it's hard. It's hard to grapple with this because if statist Zionism is the only form of Zionism, and the non-statist forms are really more a part of the past, I think it becomes a semantical issue, but it's also more than a semantical issue. I think we have to grapple with the fact of what has Zionism become? What is it becoming? I would argue that the genocide that is going on in Gaza right now is a logical conclusion of the idea behind political Zionism, which is that the existence of Palestinians is a problem. It's a problem because they get in the way of that Jewish majority. It's a form of ethnic nationalism. And, I've struggled with this personally a great deal. To call oneself an anti-Zionist is not only what one is opposing, but it is also about what is the vision of Judaism that we want to lift up. And the idea of Zionism as being a Jewish home in the land of Israel is an interesting one, because for me, as I've come to understand it, is that one of the beauties of Judaism, one of the gorgeous aspects of Jewish life, is that we've seen the world, the diaspora, as our home. That's how Judaism began. It began in the diaspora, and there's this tension because the word haaretz in Hebrew can both mean this little sliver of land that we've been talking about, but can also mean the world as a whole. And that tension is something that I think we're seeing, colliding with itself in almost unbearable ways now. So, I wonder if it's, I guess I wanted to push a little bit back on the idea of how can one call oneself a Zionist. I guess the last thing I'd say is you invoked Edward Said's essay, Zionism from the Point of View of Its Victims, which is a really an enormously important article that had a huge impact on me. That when we talk about Zionism, we can't only talk about it in terms of what Jews think it is. We have to think about it in terms of the people that it has impacted, and that the narrative that almost needs to be the primary narrative is the narrative of the oppressed. And I think if anybody should understand that, it should be the Jewish people. So I guess I wanted to ask you if you really think that, or you could foresee that this might be something that a circle that you can square,
Yeah, I mean, again, about the political Zionism that is, starts with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, I agree with you. I agree with that through line you're drawing from 1948 until this moment. I think that, and I understand why Zionism is a term that has immense meaning to both Jews and Palestinians, although they often talk about it in very different ways. I guess, to me, honestly, the thing that I think is valuable is, as we try to think about a future based on equality and justice, in which Jews can live alongside Palestinians in this land within those two principles, those frameworks, rather than with the principle of domination and supremacy. I think going back and thinking about people who were thinking about Jewish life in Israel-Palestine outside of the framework of Jewish statehood is important. I think it can be, again, it can be a usable past. Not that we embrace it uncritically by any means, but that the engagement with those texts and those thinkers can be helpful to us in thinking about what we want in the future. That, to me, is more important, honestly, than whether one calls oneself a Zionist or an anti-Zionist. It seems to me, yes, I think what you're saying is a reasonable point. One can say that Zionism lost, and therefore it doesn't have any meaning today. The other point, the other way of thinking about it is that actually to remember that there was such a Zionism is actually a way of thinking of thinking about the thread that connects us, and perhaps also, because this term has such resonance to so many Jews, a way of thinking about how they can make this bridge from supremacy to equality and justice in a way that makes them feel like they're still keeping a connection to a Jewish tradition. Again, to me, that's kind of less important, I would say, than the question of how we try to engage in the past in order to try to think of a future that I think is based on the principles that you and I would agree with.
Yeah. So,
I mean, I think your point about diaspora and home and land of Israel is a really interesting question. I think that I would agree with you.
Do you consider Israel to be your homeland? I'm curious.
I would say that I don't think of Israel as my homeland in the sense that I feel a longing that I can't be fulfilled without living there. But I do think that while one can say correctly, as you did, that many of the greatest, perhaps most of the greatest accomplishments of Jewish civilization have been in diaspora, right? And even the person that we think about as the first Jew or proto-Jew, Avraham, who, from this week's Parsha, is not from there. Right? I mean, Lech Lecha, right? That's week's Parsha, right? He has to be told to go there, right? That's not what he's from. He's not where he's from. And yet
turned to Mesopotamia.
Right. And yet, I mean, again, reading this week's Parsha and then the continuing Parsha that we'll read after this is where the covenant between God and the Jewish people is created. And our texts, although so many of those texts were written and said in exile, right? Saturating the text is the idea of a longing to return to this place. I think it's very, very difficult for me. I mean, again, you can read you can read the Babylonian Talmud, which is the more important of our two Talmuds, but it's still saturated with the idea, right, that there's something fundamentally precious and special about this place, right. Zion, right, Eretz Israel, and of course throughout our liturgy. So to me, I agree with what you say that much of the genius of Jewish civilization has been in diaspora, but it is also, I think, important to say that so much of it is also expressed the longing for that home, even if the home was perhaps a very, very abstract place for most of the people who were sitting. And then there are certain, as you know, there's certain mitzvot that can only actually be done in the land.
Right. Yeah, that point came up. Was there anyone who knew there was a Torah study, Tzedek Chicago's Torah study this last Saturday? Yeah. This came up that Abraham, the word Ivri, which means a Hebrew or one of the Hebrews, but also means Ivrit is the Hebrew language. It is mentioned the first time in the Torah is mentioned in this portion, and Ivri over means to cross over or to be an immigrant, or to be a boundary crosser. And Abraham and Sarah were the first, boundary crossers and kind of paradigmatic Jewish people that in this moment when we're wrestling with all kinds of xenophobia toward immigrants, I think it's really powerful to think about that part of our Jewish heritage or legacy of that we've always been, seeing boundaries as a porous kind of thing. But I wanted to, there was something else that you were saying that I wanted to respond to that's gone now. So maybe we can move on to your book.
Okay. If it comes to you, come back to it.
We'll come back probably right before I fall asleep tonight. So, I agree with so much of what you write in the book. I think you, in a relatively short book, really focus on some of the most important points that we need to be lifting up in this moment. The one thing that I think I was left hungry for more when I read it is it was kind of answering what you suggest in the title and what I'm hoping can be part of this conversation, which is, what does it mean to be Jewish after, well, it's not after, please God, may it be after very, very soon, but what does Judaism mean? What does Jewish community look like? And to me, that was the part of the book that it felt very similar to much of some of the things you've written before, very, very powerfully and profoundly about a vision of equality for all who live in the land. But, I struggle a great deal with, I think we're living in a moment where things are just breaking wide open in ways that we have no idea how it's going to be put back together, or even if it can wholly be put back together. And, I think that it is a moment of such an ethical divide in the Jewish community, a deep moral divide. It's more than, it's nothing new. These fissures you've written about them. Back in 2010, you wrote that article about the Jewish establishment, that these breaks and fissures have been there. But I think after October 2023, I think it's opened into an abyss. And when I say that, I mean that we have people in the Jewish community who support what Israel is doing. We have people in the Jewish community, when I say what Israel's doing, I'm just going to say committing genocide, who support genocide. There are those in the Jewish community who are on the fence about it and staying silent about it because they're afraid or they're not sure what they think or it's too complicated. And there are those Jews out of Jewish and human conscience are standing in solidarity with Palestinians because they oppose this genocide. And how you make community with such a vast moral divide, I'm not completely sure. And well, I am sure that in this moment, it's impossible to make community. I really do. But I wanted to drill a little bit deeper into the questions that you raised with the very title of the book about what does it mean to be Jewish when there is such an unprecedented moral heinousness that is being perpetrated in the name of all Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I didn't answer that question well because I don't have a good answer. Because I think the questions you're raising are so big that I feel just kind of overwhelmed when I try to think about it. I mean, I guess just a few random tentative thoughts. I mean, the first thing I think just to say is that like there's nothing inevitable about the fact that um, that a people have to face a kind of moral crisis and reckoning because they've done horrifying things. I mean, right? I mean, you know, the Nakba in 1948 was a horrifying thing, right? I mean, was it, it was the expulsion of more than half of the Palestinian population from during the creation of the State of Israel. I think we'd be very hard pressed to look at Judaism in the decades after 1948 and feel like there was some kind of crisis among Jews in the sense that they were tormented by the fact that and this would happen 3 years after the Holocaust, right? That they had turned to Jews. I mean, there were individual people who recognized this, but they were very much a minority, right? And when one talks about genocide, I mean, does one get the sense that people's sense of Americanism is plagued by the fact that we all walk around in a place on a continent that was forged by genocide? No, I don't think most people, they certainly, there are exceptions and God bless them, right? But they're small exceptions. I guess the first one was like in some ways, like it's the work that you are doing and people like you who I think are trying to force a reckoning and force people to say Judaism has to look fundamentally different after this. For many people, that's simply not the case, right? And it's not inevitable that it would be the case. Really, it isn't. I mean, because for a number of reasons. Because for some people, because many people, Israel is their Judaism, period. And there really, the support for the state, and there really isn't very much without it, period. Mm-hmm. And there's very little. Many of them don't, I mean, there's little on offer to them that would even allow them to think outside of that. And then there are other people for whom, Judaism is a religion of law, mitzvot, that really just doesn't have much of a moral element to it at all. I mean, I sometimes think about Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who I write in my book, and the irony of Leibovitz is that he was a great moral critic of what Israel's doing, but his view was that Judaism had nothing to do with it. Yeah. Right? For him, Judaism was observing the 613 mitzvot, and that was all you needed to do. I don't think Leibovitz would have had a problem davening in a minyan. I imagine he probably did all the time. The only thing he cared about the minyan davening is he's surrounded by other people who are basically trying to follow these mitzvot, which he didn't think had a moral character. For him, morality and Judaism were separate. But
how do you feel about davening in a minyan with people who...
I have complicated feelings, about it. I think there's a part of me that feels that there's something fundamentally wrong. And that sometimes I even think that maybe something dramatic has to happen, like blood has to stop dripping from the walls or something, for people to kind of realize that we're engaged in some kind of fundamentally farcical and horrifying project. There are other times when, to be honest, I think that I spend my days working and thinking, writing critically about Israel, hopefully in some tiny way, being part of this much, much larger movement for Palestinian freedom 6 days of the week. And for me, prayer and study on Shabbat, and even when I do it today, is something different than that. In some ways, it's a very different kind of experience than the very political experiences that I have, that are my days Sunday through Friday. And I also, I also find, and I will say, in modern Orthodox spaces where the politics tends to be even worse than the average in American Jewish community, I find things that I find very, very compelling. And they're not moral. And that's, I mean, this is, have ambivalence about saying this. They are the very, very fervent, intense devotion to Jewish study, the insistence that it be transmitted to the next generation, the emphasis on Jewish literacy, the willingness to take, as Leib would say, to take up the burden of the yoke of the mitzvot, even when it is very countercultural and even when it's a pain in the ass, you know? And I also am often struck, and again, maybe I'm conditioned by having grown up around South Africans, right? Like that I am reminded very frequently that when I think about judging people morally, I am reminded very frequently that there are oftentimes people I meet whose views about the world, Israel, Palestine, maybe also America, are ones that I think are immoral, profoundly immoral. And then I think that I see the way they live their lives. And I think in many ways, the way they live their lives, in terms of the impact they have on the people who they impact most, who are the people closest to them, I actually think have a lot, they seem to me often quite moral and quite impressive in a lot of ways. I don't think that I'm just reluctant to boil down my analysis of people to their political views, because I think that actually people are much, much more complicated than that. There are people who I think who have really, really terrific politics who I think often are actually not very moral in the way they treat people around them. So these for me are some of the contradictions that I really that I wrestle with. It also just happens sociologically. Again, I'm not saying maybe these are views that I will rethink in the future. For me, prayer, being in Jewish community is a particular thing, and there is very little overlap today between the politics that I hold and the kind of religious Jewish spaces in which I am most comfortable praying. I would love for that Venn diagram to grow. And I think I'm incredibly inspired by networks like the Halachic Left that are trying to do that. But it still remains that these are very different worlds. And so those are some of the ways that I think about it personally.
Oh, thank you. That's very clarifying. I think for me, I appreciate that you brought up the issue of American colonialism and because that's part of this piece, and that reminds me that I think the difference for me about being an American as opposed to being a Jewish person is that I was taught growing up. I did not grow up in a halachic Jewish, or traditional Orthodox environment, but the values that were instilled in me about what it means to be Jewish were that the core of Judaism and Jewish tradition, or what it means to be Jewish, is the ethical values. But without that, what is the point? That doesn't mean I don't love Jewish learning and the other parts of what it means to be in the Jewish community, but that the sacred core of it are the ethical precepts, and without that, I don't know what it means to be Jewish. Whereas as an American, whatever public school tried to instill in me about what it means to be American did not take. I mean, and maybe that comes from growing up with parents who were on the left. I think there was an appreciation that I got from my folks that they both on both sides, they were immigrants and came here to us, that America was a haven for them. But I don't look to American values to teach me anything about what it means to be an ethical human being. I happen to have been born in the United States. I benefit and privileged as a white male who was born when I was born in a certain time. But that is not as central to my identity of what it means to be a moral human being than the Jewish part of me that I think has become so deeply challenged by the fusion of settler colonial ethno-nationalism with Judaism, so what we're seeing going on now, really, I've come to realize is just a continuation of that fusion, which is it's a very recent
Yes.
phenomenon in Jewish history. It's brand new, really.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's really, really important to emphasize. It's also, though, I mean, I think that to me, what's exciting about the work that I think you're doing, that I see a lot of people doing, especially younger people doing, is
I'm older than you, by the way.
yes, yes. I didn't mean you as the younger person, but I think more credit to you that you're doing it as an older person. I mean, I think when I think about the minyanim that are emerging in New York, that are mostly led by younger people, and I think it's I think that it's an illusion to think that one inevitably brings one's own values to the texts. The texts don't speak for themselves, right? Inevitably, one sees and emphasizes certain things in the text because you bring that a priori. Whether some people admit that or not, some people don't admit that, but I think that's the truth. I'm very wary of anyone suggesting that there is some essence in Judaism that conforms to, that centers human dignity or human equality or justice, all these things. I mean, it's there, and its opposite is also there. I mean, right? Look at what we're reading around this here. We've got Abraham challenging God when God wants to destroy Sodom, right? And we venerate Abraham for that. And we've also got Abraham when God says, kill your son, Abraham says, absolutely, let me get up early in the morning and go do that for you, right?
Why stop with Abraham? We have God who, commands the Israelites to go in and massacre the Canaanites, but also is compassionate and slow to anger and
right.
All of those other wonderful traits.
Yeah. So to me, I think to me what's exciting is the idea that you recognize that you have, on the one hand, you have prior principles of your own, beliefs that you have. And you go and you kind of wrestle with the text, and hopefully not just kind of, there's a dance in which you're not basically just kind of, you're not ignoring the things that speak in a different voice, but you're actually trying to grapple with them. And what's amazing is we have such a rich tradition of vast amounts of commentary, so much of which is so radical, so dramatic, right? That you can basically find examples of this kind of radical rethinking in almost any text, right? And then you can do the work of actually being in it and trying to think it through. And I do think that what I totally agree with is I think that the centrality, and I even argue in the book that's like the idolatry of the state has been so deadening to so much of that. I mean, it's not just, I think, morally a catastrophe. I think it's really deadening in terms of Jewish creativity and Jewish learning. And I mean, I in the sense that you, in a way, when you surrender your understanding of Judaism to the state, you basically are saying the state will tell me what it means to be Jewish, right? I don't have to be involved in that sense of grappling. I just sign up and I defend the state, whatever the state does, right? And so I think that when you, to the degree that people are willing, that people move away from the worship of the state, which is, I think, really what we see suffuses so much Jewish life. I mean, in the sense that there's no line the state could possibly cross that would lead you to question the legitimacy of the state, right? As people move away from that, they're left, I think, in a way with a hugely blank canvas in a lot of ways. And what inspires me is when I see people rising to that challenge by doing the work of Jewish creativity, by engaging with Jewish texts and really trying to figure out how to make them have meaning in a way that conforms with their values, but doesn't actually, but also recognizes their radical otherness in a way.
Yeah, no, I think we're of the same mind about this. I don't disagree with what you're saying about that we bring what we bring to the text, that there's no inherent essence or pshat or literal, truth to what it means to be Jewish, like with any other tradition for that matter. And I also react very strongly when I hear people on the Jewish left talk about how Zionism is kind of this errant weed that has poisoned Judaism. I always say, no, you need to recognize that this is Judaism, and it's a part of Judaism that you need to own as well. I mean, every tradition has its good, its bad, and its ugly, and to say, to hold on to this myth of innocence that,
Yes.
you know, I have this pristine tradition that has
Right.
now been poisoned by this alien,
Right.
you know, thing called Zionism, I think is problematic. For me, it's, you know, so I fully own the fact that we all bring our biases to the kind of tradition we adhere to. But I would argue that that the ethical teachings of Judaism are the best of Judaism. In other words, they're, you know, that I don't deny all of what our heritage is, but we need to make very clear, conscious moral decisions, especially in the age of Zionism, about what are the parts of Judaism we're going to uphold, and what are the parts of Judaism we're going to say, you know, this I am going to, you know, fight this as a Jewish person and as a person of conscience, you know, because both of those things are intertwined. You know, Mark Ellis, who is a Jewish, was a Jewish scholar who wrote a lot about these issues that we're talking about, and he and I would argue about this all the time. He would argue that what he called the prophetic is indigenous to Judaism, and he would argue about essentializing Judaism, and I would always push him on that and say, well, what do you mean by the prophetic? And he would never really define that for me. But he would, what I was taken by what he, and I think how he influenced me was that he was saying back in the 80s that what he called, the way he termed it was, this is the end of ethical Jewish history. The founding of the state of Israel after the Holocaust, after the cataclysm of the Holocaust. And he was saying this well before any of us were saying this, and paid a very dear price for doing it. And that part of what he said, I really carry forward. That no, I don't deny the Jewishness of any of it, but what I want to fight for is what I believe is the best of the tradition that we've been bequeathed.
Yes, yes. No, I would completely agree with that. I mean, look, there were people in the United States in the 19th century, you know, making a Christian argument for slavery and a Christian argument against slavery. And who's to say who had the better, and there were rabbis doing the same thing, right? And who's to say who had the better objective case in the sources? I mean, there's a lot of slavery in Torah and Talmud, right? At the best you can say is that it's limited, but there's really no one saying that there shouldn't be any slavery, you know? So the point is not, to me, right, the question is like, who has the better textual argument in a narrow sense? The question is like, yeah, what is your basic worldview? Right. Is it equality oriented? Is it grounded on the idea of that all human beings are created equal in the image of God, and all human beings have incalculable value and dignity, or is it not? And if you start from the place that I think that, you know, Rabbi Rosen and I start from, then you can do lots of you can work through the tradition in that way. And luckily you have many people who've been doing that before you, who you can follow. But it doesn't make sense to suggest that, you know, Ben Gvir and Smotrich don't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, they are reading texts too, right? Meir Kahane was reading texts, and they had plenty of texts that they could find. And I think in a way there's a weird, and I think that we don't do ourselves any favors by pretending that that's not the case.
Are we doing on time, by the way? Are we on the hour?
It's been an hour. Yeah.
All right. Well, I could talk for another hour, but I want this to be an open conversation. So, yeah.
Probably the live stream can't hear questions from the audience. Is people can ask their questions, and if you could just repeat them when you finish them. Yeah.
Right behind you is someone.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for being here, and a pleasure reading both earlier in the year when it first came out. My question is about how concerned you are, what do you make of some of the developments that have happened over the past year in media, especially regarding, I don't know, like CNN, or, you know, kind of a push from top down to kind of press, I would say like like a strongly unquestioning science, kind of viewpoint, and through legacy media, or what do you make of that? I guess, how do you see that kind of unfolding over the next few years?
Sure, I'll answer, but of course, Rabbi Rosen should. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You're sorry.
The question, as I understand it, was how do we respond to the bias towards Zionism in the media, and do we see that changing or that paradigm shifting in any way? But you wanted to
yeah, and of course, jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, another famous quote from Edward Said was that Palestinians lack permission to narrate, right? And I think that I thought before October 7th that there might be some modest progress in that regard, that I thought that the impact of Black Lives Matter and maybe Me Too and of kind of forcing questions of representation onto center stage might create a little bit more space for Palestinians in the mainstream media. Unfortunately, October 7th has really dramatically set that back, basically, and made people just, I think, often just made it even harder, frankly, for Palestinians to narrate their own experience, which is just a disaster. I mean, it's a disaster partly just because you can't have an intelligent conversation about what's happening to Palestinians without listening to Palestinians. It's not because Palestinians are inherently smarter than anybody else, but Palestinians have more insight, right? And more connections and more language skills and all the basic building blocks that you need to understand things. I mean, when I talk to Palestinians about things that are happening in Gaza and the West Bank or whatever, even in Israel proper, often what I end up thinking is, gosh, I know so little, right? Because and so I think it's also a dehumanizing conversation, right? Again, you end up talking about Palestinians without listening to Palestinians. So I think, unfortunately, that's been set back by October 7th, and now it's been set back again by the whole process of Donald Trump trying to basically take control of the media. And part of what that means is also putting those authoritarian billionaires who are going to, support Trump's agenda are also generally very pro-Israel. So we see CBS News kind of moving in this direction under the leadership of Barry Weiss. I think the flip side is that those institutions don't matter as much as they used to, right? Especially among younger people, because so many people are getting the news from social media, right? And so that has been a space where Palestinians have been able to narrate so far. Again, that could change too. TikTok, billionaires can change the algorithms. None of it is guaranteed, right? But at least for the time being, Palestinians, even despite the fact that those tech companies sometimes work against them, I think have been able to have more success in narrating their experience, which is part of the reason you see this huge generational gap, because younger people are getting more of their news from social media.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I think I can speak for a lot of people in this room watching that the past few years have seen a lot of personal relationships with our families really strained, fractured in many cases. Speaking personally, I've kind of gone from, well, I just done one article, last few articles.
Didn't work though, huh?
I'll say your writing, I think, has at least gotten up. Well, I've seen this point here, more so than many, so kudos there. I've kind of gone from, if I just send them one article or if I have this one conversation, they'll see Palestinians people around. And I pivoted very strongly to screw these people, I'm done, they're not my cousin anymore, whatever. And now I've kind of landed on this sort of center stage of like, well, I don't need to worry about what they think. I need to build. I need to work. I was very taken with the article on Jewish Currents about the need for being Jewish. So my question is sort of a practical one.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for somebody like me who's energized to build and wants to see that community flourish?
Yeah.
What steps can we take to build the Jewish future, and frankly, to maybe go a little bit beyond study?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've landed in exactly the right place. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you want me to? The question was, given that you have lost faith in the idea of convincing other people in your family who have a different point of view to see things differently, you've landed in the place that you want to build new Jewish institutions for people who are interested in a Judaism which is not morally corrupted by this idolatry of this ethno-nationalist state. How do you go about and do that? And I think, I think in this moment of like terrible evil and despair, this is something that I see as something which is really hopeful. I mean, I do think that there is I'm again and again struck by the enormous amount of talent that there is, particularly, although not only among younger American Jews, who want to do exactly these things, who want to create new forms of Jewish life that are not only more ethical, but I actually think in some ways much more religiously or even culturally meaningful, because I think that what's been on offer is not just immoral, but I actually think just not compelling. I mean, I think it doesn't offer a Judaism that can help people really wrestle with life's questions. So I would say whatever it is that where your particular passions and talents lie, that's what I would invest in. If it's religious, if it's secular, if it's art, if it's music, if it's literature, if it's whatever it is, I would think, how can I contribute to can I be part of building an institution that uses this talent and passion that I have in order to give people a way of accessing being Jewish in a meaningful, committed way, which doesn't go through, saluting a state that practices apartheid and genocide. And I think there's a huge amount of different kind of stuff that's emerging, whether it's people creating anti-Zionist minyanim, or people, studying the Bund, or people, doing all range of different kinds of things, and I think that what makes me really, what's so hopeful to me is this feeling that people like you are going to create things so that your children's generation will have a whole range of different options, and that you might not have had, that I didn't have, right? And so we won't have to continue to have that we will, for not everybody, for a significant amount of people, we'll break this cycle, basically, of people having to kind of emerge into adulthood and feel like they were betrayed by the institutions in which they were raised.
Yeah. Just very quickly to
Yeah.
piggyback on that. I mean, that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years at Tzedek Chicago. And you mentioned Ariel Angel's article, which I recommend folks here read. We Need New Jewish Institutions. In that article, she kind of surveys the landscape of what's emerging right now. And as Peter is saying, it really runs the gamut. I mean, we are kind of a straightforward congregation, but there are study groups. There's also, by the way, an article that was just came out, I think, in the Sunday New York Times on this issue, which is amazing that New York Times is paying attention to this. But they run the gamut, and I think the conventional Jewish congregation, which is what we're doing, is not the only model. In fact, the conventional American congregation is also a very recent phenomenon in Jewish history. And it's certainly not the only model for creating Jewish community and Jewish coming together. There's a new Jewish day school in Boston. There's davening minyanim. There are learning groups. There are completely secular groups, Jewish Voice for Peace chapters. And so I want to just piggyback on what Peter is saying about whatever passion that draws you Jewishly. I think we're in a very exciting time of seeing that emergence.
How about over there?
Yeah, Peter, I read your book. I was curious, how has it been received in your community? What are people saying to you? Do you think you've moved the needle with anybody?
So the question is, how has my book been received in my community? Have I moved the needle? I mean, some of my closest friends are people with whom I really don't discuss Israel and Palestine at all. That's the kind of the terms they are. And then, so I wouldn't say that I've been successful. I haven't been, and yeah.
Jewish people who read your book coming to give you feedback. Like, what have you heard that made you surprised that you heard?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, there's always there's a bit of a selection bias. So the people who, pick up the book are probably likely already to kind of, agree with a lot of it already. And so I think, though, the thing that I am really gratified when people tell me they are giving the book to someone in their family, their community, who has a different perspective. I'm always cognizant, again, Rabbi Rosen and I started by talking about that our own journeys certainly in my case, didn't happen overnight. There was a long process. So I feel like in some ways it would be foolish of me to expect that necessarily someone's going to read something that I write and then immediately change their views. I think that there's a process in which if one is going to really rethink things, one has to kind of like go through some internal process in which one can come to imagine oneself differently. And sometimes that does even require like thinking about, there are people who would have to give up their job if they decided that my views were right. Most people in official Jewish positions would not be able to have the jobs they're in, right? And other people would have to rethink a lot of their relationships. So I recognize these things take time. What does strike me is the way in which very frequently among younger people that process happens much faster than it is among younger people. And so you will literally meet, and Simone Zimmer has kind of like become a poster child for this, but I meet lots and lots of people, and it's like, I meet them in an encampment, and then they tell me that in their Jewish day school 2 years earlier, they were a pro-Israel activist, and I think there is something about the plasticity of being younger where that happens much faster. And that is something that I do notice. And maybe my book for some of those people has played a small role, but there are also so many other things that I think sources of information that are catalyzing that.
Over here, so see people. I feel like. Okay. How about over here, right in front?
So, I think, by the way, my name's Gail Luxembourg, Marshall's got pause. Sorry, I'll try to breathe on anyone, but, I think you're right in that this conversation is, happening at a wider level and seeping into life in many ways. I will tell you, I have a son who was trained by Brant, who was an activist. I was a Jewish communal leader. We have different last names. He was wearing a Palestinian flag outside my office. And now he's writing for the New York Times. And I was shocked when, the Times, his stuff is all over. We know his point of view, and he's writing for The Guardian, he's writing for BBC. It's more mainstream.
Yes.
However, our paths crossed when you wrote your last book, and I booked you, and I was the CEO of the Marcus Jewish Community Center in Atlanta.
I remember that well.
And you almost got me fired my first week on the job.
I'm sorry.
On the front page of the New York Times. And my leadership made me move you off the campus. We couldn't even sit down and have a conversation. And I don't think 10 years later, it's any different.
Yeah.
So my question is, though the world is changing, it seems to be changing from the bottom up.
Yes.
And I don't see where there's any leadership here advancing the notion, and it still feels very fringe. We're here. We're not in Temple Shalom down the street. I mean, how do these ideas get to be ones that you can talk about without people fearing for their lives because we're going to have the conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question is, I hear you. It's nice to see you again. I remember that very well. The question as I hear it is basically, are the institutions really changing, right? In the sense that most of the Jewish institutions, certainly the most powerful ones, are unwilling to make any space for the perspective that we're sharing here, or more importantly, for Palestinians, right? I mean, I think that's true. In a certain way, you could even say there's a certain kind of hardening, but I think something there are things that are and it is depressing to me that there are so many Jewish leaders who I think are not rising to this moment, and who seem to me, again, Megan, forgive me if this sounds self-righteous. I don't mean to be self-righteous, but to me, they seem to me to be the equivalent of all of these Republican politicians I see, and these business leaders and all these other people. And I think, okay, you're going to keep your job. But to what end? I mean, like, really? I mean, you're going to be judged. We're all going to be judged. I mean, in some form or another, whether you believe you're judged by Hashem or you believe you're judged by your grandchildren, like we're judged. And it just doesn't seem to me that this is something that I would want to have to answer for in the final years of my life or after my death, you know? And so I just seem to me like it's hard for me sometimes to understand why people can't step back and say, like, okay, yeah, I might take this vision, I might lose my job. But most of these people are actually among the people who could most afford to lose their jobs. I mean, when I see a lot of these young people, like college students, they actually have much more to lose, right? And it seems to me so often the people who have the most to lose, have the least security, are the ones who show the greatest courage. And the people who actually have the greatest margin of safety and security in all kinds of ways are so wedded to the jobs, the titles, the worlds in which they live, that they seem blinded by those things, to my mind. I think the difference is that 10 years ago, Jewish leaders confidently asserted that there was a consensus, right? Now, what's interesting, if you listen to these Jewish leaders, is they are forced to try to explain away this, this pathology that exists. And they are kind of, it's interesting to see how they try, they'll say, well, these people they don't know enough, they don't love Jews, they don't love Jews enough, but they are grappling with the recognition that the consensus has fractured, even if they're not willing to platform these people. And I think one of the reasons they're having to grapple with it is those families of Jewish leaders. I mean, you're making this point yourself. The families of the Jewish leaders are not so different than all the other families, right? And so in many, many of those families, they know that the younger generation in their own families has not been convinced, right? And so they have to grapple with it. And what I say to this, and I talk to some of these people sometimes, and I say this all the time. I say, listen, I know you wish that people of my political views didn't exist, but unfortunately for you, we do. We're not a majority, but we're not a tiny minority, right? The Washington Post just found that I think 39% of American Jews think Israel's committing genocide, right? So if you recognize they exist, but you're sure that these people aren't well educated or they don't have the right values, then surely what you should be doing is having public conversations with those people so you can make it clear, you can convince them of your point of view. If you're not willing to ever have public conversations with them, maybe it suggests you're not as confident, actually, as you claim to be, right? And I think that's what we see. And that's why people have to build alternative institutions.
I have a question from the chat. Yeah. We have from S.B. Miller. How can Peter and Rabbi Brant reconcile their differing views about whether and how the Jewish world can come together somehow, someday?
This kind of echoes the question we just heard from Gail. You referred to like the institutional Judaism versus the fringe, and when you look at Jewish life, we've always been a community of subcultures. We've never been a centralized, we have the myth of Klal Yisrael, the entire Jewish people. But the truth is, we have it's a umbrella of many different Jewish communities that are doing things that often look very different from one another, and that's always been the case. So in some ways, I don't despair over the idea that we need to build new Jewish institutions in this moment, because that in moments of crisis, Jewish community has always behaved that way. And hey, fringe is very Jewish. Jews have always lived in the borderlands, made a very comfortable home there. And I think the Jewish establishment are really collaborating with the worst of the world. They have a lot of resources, there's no question. I mean, you can't even compare it. But I don't think too much about this coming together, as the question is, because I don't know that in a literal, practical sense we ever really have. We've always been cultural sub-communities, and that's all right. I think the difference is that we are living in a moral moment that I think is unprecedented in Jewish history, because Jewish political power in this way is, so I shouldn't say Jewish political power, I should say Jewish nation statism is unprecedented. And that is creating what I called an abyss that I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that we're in the midst of it now, and I don't know how the pieces will come back together, if at all, because we're still in the midst of that moment. So.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. I mean, I agree with Brant that Jews have never been unified, nor should we. I mean, it's not, we don't need to be unified. I think to me the question is, which I wrestle with, is how can we find ways of expressing care and concern and solidarity with one another across these very profound divides. And I think part of me, honestly, I think part of that care and concern and solidarity is actually speaking to other Jews and saying that they think that they are enabling terrible, terrible things. And trying to speak to other Jews because we care about them. But also, I think trying to speak to them in a way that hopefully is more likely that they will be able to, make it more likely that they will listen. And I also think that it is worth looking, to me, one of the tragedies, one of the most painful things since October 7th has been that I've so often felt that Jewish institutions made it kind of curated solidarity or created spaces for solidarity, which said in order to show solidarity, you have to support this project of the destruction of Palestinian life. And I think, I think what we should be looking for is how can we create ways of expressing Jewish solidarity that don't, right? And I think there are. I mean, I think that, I think there's nothing about, for instance, expressing, praying for hostages, right? Which can be an act of Jewish solidarity. It's a very deep Jewish tradition to care about Jewish hostages and captives, even as we also pray, as we should, for Palestinians who are suffering genocide, for Palestinian prisoners who are being tortured, for all these things, right? I think it's important for us to look for opportunities to express solidarity in ways that does not make us complicit in genocide and apartheid. And I think that's something that I think we should think about creative ways to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's a necessarily agreement there, which is okay.
What about the role of American rabbis? And in part, I want to ask this because obviously you're a rabbi, but also because of the Jewish Currents coverage of the anti-Mamdani letter, and also your discussion earlier here about your own religious practice being somewhat separate from your political experience. And I'm wondering what we should be asking of rabbis and whether that should be in somewhat more forceful because it's an ethical question, or less so than what we would ask of other Jewish institutional leaders that don't necessarily have a religious component to their work.
I'll say something. The question was, what should we ask of rabbis? I mean, one thing we could, one model, right, is to simply say to ask rabbis to say that weighing in on a campaign like this, a political decision, is not their job description. They have no actual, they have no comparative advantage in this experience. I mean, I said Kaddish for close to a year at a Young Israel, very, very right-wing, probably the politics most of the people would, probably Trump supporters. But one of the things that I tremendously admired about the rabbi is that he didn't see politics as his role at all. I mean, all he did was teach texts, And so I think that's one thing you could say. It's just don't be involved in this, right? Because you don't have I think most rabbis, frankly, don't actually have very much to add on those questions, really. So that's one thing. I mean, if you are going to, I think if you are going to take a position, I think the question is like, what values are you operating from? To go back to the point we were questioning, right? I mean, like, to me, what is shocking, but also and so revealing about the Mamdani thing is that it really illustrates in a very stark way what the hierarchies of values are, right? The hierarchy of value is the worst possible thing that a politician could do is challenge unconditional support for Israel and challenge Israeli impunity, suggest that that international law should apply to Israel, right? Suggest that, God forbid, Israel should be based on the principle of equality under the law. Ensuring that such a politician does not get elected is far more important than ensuring that a man who the Justice Department said sexually harassed 13 women does not get elected, right? So I imagine rabbis, I would wonder what message that sends to the people in those congregations who have been sexually harassed and might think that they want to go to the rabbi for pastoral care, right? Because you're clearly saying that's actually not your highest priority, right? It also suggests that you don't, that opposing bigotry is not a particularly important value because Andrew Cuomo has been enmeshed in very crude anti-Muslim bigotry, and the entire Mamdani campaign has been suffused by anti-Muslim bigotry. So on the one hand, I remember these very rabbis going on and saying, we feel betrayed by all these other communities that have not stood up for Jews in our moment of availability. Well, what kind of job are you doing standing up for Muslims in a moment of unprecedented, extraordinary anti-Muslim bigotry? And you're saying, it's fine. We'll go with the anti-Muslim bigot, right? And the final point is, what does it say about how much you care about American democracy, right? I mean, have any of these, I have not noticed any of these rabbis speak out as forcefully against Donald Trump as they have against Zoran Mamdani, right? So maintaining, Israeli impunity is actually also a higher value than preserving America as a free country. Right, as a liberal democracy. So to me, that's very revealing.
Yeah. I was really sickened by that letter. I was even more sickened by the fact that over 1,000 rabbis signed it. I was not surprised. I was certainly not surprised that the rabbi, I won't mention names, but the rabbi of the Park Avenue Synagogue, I mean, that should tell you a great deal about the kinds of people that rabbi was speaking for. So, on that level, on the issue of electoral politics, I agree with Peter that I don't think rabbis have any more or less to add than anyone else during elections. But in terms of political advocacy, I mean, I have been inspired. The rabbis who inspire me the most are not necessarily the most learned. There are people like Abraham Joshua Heschel who marched with King. There are people like Leonard Bierman in Los Angeles, where I grew up, who Leonard Bierman became a rabbi at Leo Beck Temple, and his very first Shabbat, the Rosenbergs were executed that day, and he mentioned their names before Kaddish and almost lost his job on his very first Shabbat. And he spent his entire career at Leo Beck because his congregants respected him so much, even if they didn't always agree with him. People like, I could go down the list of the rabbis who, their politics were very much a part of their Jewish vision. I'm not arguing that rabbis should not get politically active. I think, what we're seeing in this current moment, especially with laws being changed where rabbis can now endorse candidates from the Bima and things like that, I totally agree with Peter, but I can't count now the amount of times I've been in Congress people's offices, and whether it's here or on the Hill. And I think that's part of the job description, that politics is not a separate category of being a moral individual. So yeah, that's another thought.
So we're out of time. I'll leave it up to you two if you want to take one more question.
I'll defer to Rabbi Rosen.
Yeah, let's take one more question.
Okay, one more question. Sorry. Back here in the back there with your hand up. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rachel. This is kind of in the questions about Jewish traditions and kind of a constellation that goes together. So I'm wondering, for parents of young children, four and six, go to Tzedek family program, I love it. And we're thinking about starting, a Jewish, non-anti, whatever, Zionist, because we don't have one that our kids doing. And so we have to be held responsible to do that.
Yes, we have it on record now.
Great. What's your mind is the narrative around Zionism or anti-Zionism that we begin to share with our children? And also, how do we express what we want to build? Like, is there a new word? How do we begin to build? Because I grew up in a very Zionist Jewish day school, and like I know that narrative, but I was thinking about our curriculum this summer, and it's like, I see things from Aviva and the people that we're learning with, but I wonder what you think about that.
That's good, you.
You.
Both of us.
Do you want to say?
The question was, how do we educate our children in a Jewish anti-Zionist context, and what are the kinds of values that we're looking to raise them in? We're learning about this as we go, as I know you know. The term anti-Zionist, when Tzedek Chicago became anti-Zionist, we switched from non to anti, which again was not just semantical. It was the product of a lot of discussion in the congregation. But one of the points that leadership made when the congregation voted to make the change was that it's part of what we are. It's not the all of what we are, but it's a very important part, because Zionism looms so large in Jewish life. And I think many of us were very influenced by Angela Davis's, she famously said, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist, that you can't be neutral on something. If you're looking to dismantle something and replace it with something more equitable, you have to be clear that you are anti. But I think pedagogically with children, we're not just talking about opposing Israel. That I think that people have that stereotype about anti-Zionists, that we're just chanting "Free Palestine" all the time at our Tu B'Shvat Seder or whatever. But it's a longer conversation. It depends on the ages we're talking about. I would say that much of what we do in our congregation isn't a whole lot different, really, than most congregations, whether it's the services we do or the education we do. The basics are really the same, and we have to have just deep conversations about the values component of our education. And that goes to pedagogy. It goes to what is the most effective way to instill this in our children. But so I guess that's my fumbling way of saying it's a much longer conversation, but a really important one to have.
Well, I think first of all, it's amazing that you're thinking about doing this, and I just think I have a strong sense for that if you build something that more people will come than you can even imagine. Right? I think there's a huge hunger for these kind of things, and I don't have any expertise in early childhood education or how to run summer camps or any of that. But I do think that, as Rabbi Rosen was saying, and I do think the foundational experience seems to me like to cultivate experiences of joy and fascination and wonder with Judaism and being Jewish. That's the most important thing, so in a way that just means keeping Zionism in Israel to the side, and then when one starts talking about principles and values, to start from the idea that, there is a Jewish story, there is a Jewish people, there is even a belief that we have a particular and special relationship with God. Lots of other peoples have their own particular and special relationship with God, but that Torah doesn't start with Abraham and the covenant. It starts with universal human beings, all of whom are created equal in the image of God, and that's the foundational principle that we choose to center with our kids, right? And then everything else builds from there, right? And so I think that that seems to me like from a moral standpoint where one can start, and then I think talented people like you can figure out how to build that in all kinds of really fascinating ways that are appropriate for kids.
I'm sorry to cut it off. I wish it's clear to me that we could have this conversation all night, and again, just speaks to the need for these discussions. Thank you all so much for coming. It's really an honor to be here with you, and thank you, Brant and Peter. This has been such a fantastic conversation.